Hi. I've been using MPC 1 and Live 2 for a while, but I've not spent quality time with an MPC X yet. A few weeks ago, Akai sent over the special edition MPC X, which is a good opportunity to look at what added value it has in the MPC family compared to MPC Live, MPC 1, MPC Key 61, Studio Mark II, and even Force. First, a quick disclosure. Other than Akai sending this over, they have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. This channel is funded mainly by viewers who subscribe to exclusive content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Before I talk about the differences between this and everything else, I think it's more important to talk about how all of these are similar. All the MPCs run the same MPC OS, except MPC Studio Mark II, which is just a controller for the MPC software. All the MPCs can work either in controller mode with the MPC software on a computer or standalone without a computer. And projects you make on one should run smoothly on all the others, with the one exception that the special edition MPC X, like the MPC Key 61, have 4 GB of RAM instead of 2 GB of RAM on the others, so you might not be able to load a sample-heavy project on these. The original black MPC X, by the way, has 2 GB of RAM as well, like the old ones. The exception to running the standard MPC OS is Akai's Force, which uses a different but very similar operating system. Force can't run in controller mode with the MPC software, but a recent firmware update lets you import MPC projects into Force. That said, I've seen issues when doing that, so I wouldn't say it's 100% compatible. I won't be comparing all these too much to Force in this video because Force is really about whether you want a 64-pad interface. So projects with large samples aside, the differences aren't about whether you can create better music with any of these, but rather the hands-on controls, both in terms of creating music and performing it, as well as connectivity, storage capacity that isn't RAM, meaning hard drive content, bundled content on that hard drive or that you can download, and portability. I'll take a look at all these differences one by one in just a bit, but before I do, a burning question that might be on your mind is the difference between the special edition MPC X and the original MPC X. That boils down to 4 things: 4 gigs of RAM on the SE compared to 2 gigs on the original X, and then there are 32 gigabytes of internal storage. It says 26.2 here, and 10 are free, around 10, and the rest is factory content. That compared to 16 in total on the original MPC X. Then there are more bundled plugins on MPC X Special Edition. So the Special Edition comes with Fabric XL, Fabric, OPX4, the pianos and the strings, all of Akai's recent goodies, except for Mini D, you get a trial of that, and the Flavor Pro effect. And then the final obvious difference is that the Special Edition has the retro color scheme instead of the black original MPC X. Okay, so the Special Edition obviously costs more. Let's see how this and the MPC X compared to the rest of the MPCs in the family. The most visible difference is the number of buttons, knobs, and hands-on controls, and in that department, the most important difference, in my opinion, isn't the number of buttons, even though MPC X and Special Edition have more than double the buttons of most of the others, but rather the thing that I found makes the most profound difference are the 16 Q-links as opposed to 4 typically on other MPCs with their OLED screens and their dedicated mode buttons. If you're an MPC user, feel free to disagree with me below, but the Q-links on MPC 1 and MPC Live just don't get a lot of use out of me. Certainly not as much as these do on the MPC X. There are a few reasons I don't use them as much. First, there's no on-screen indication as to which of the 5 Q-link modes you're in. You can, of course, hold the Q-link button, and then you'll see which of the 5 modes you're on here. And the Q-links have capacitive touch, so the second you touch them, you'll see a pop-up that tells you what each of them does. But the font here is really small and a bit hard to make out, and the Q-links can do quite a few things. I'll go through these modes very briefly if you're not familiar with the MPC. So there are 5 general modes, and if I long press in screen mode, they do different things depending on which screen you're on. In pad parameter, each Q-link controls the same parameter for multiple pads. Pad scene controls different parameters for a single pad. In program mode, you map them to control different program parameters. And in project mode, you map them to control parameters across your entire project. So back to here, you can view these on screen and you can view what they do over here per mode. But it's an extra step. And like I mentioned, if you're on a particular screen, you may not be, say, for example, controlling the screen parameters. So I find myself just picking a parameter and controlling it with the data encoder, which can sometimes be pretty slow. So certainly using the Q-links is faster. And the second reason why using only 4 Q-links is a bit of a challenge is because everything here is designed inherently around 16 Q-links. Now you can move around between banks of 4 using the Q-link button, but if I go ahead into Q-link edit, then you'll see that in some of the tabs or Q-link modes, they move left to right, and in others they move down to up. In some cases, I think it would make more sense to arrange them differently. So say, for example, if I go into sample edit here and go into screen control mode, you can see that I can very easily choose the start of the sample, the end of the sample, zoom in and out. If I go into sample edit here, the Q-links are still arranged like this. You'll see, for example, that this row, and notice that I'm not in the right mode. Let's go to screen mode. So this row controls the sample start at different speeds. If I want to control the sample end, I need to go into this row or this bank of Q-links. And if I want to zoom in, I think, yeah, it's this bank. So it might make sense over here. I think that here it would have been better, say, if this knob controlled start, end, zoom, and so on. And like you may have seen in the intro, it's really easy to zip around between the different Q-link modes. If you're in the wrong mode, the little OLED screens or digital scribble strips show you very quickly where you're at and what you can use. So bottom line, Q-links are a major workflow pro for MPC X, and it's worth mentioning that MPC Studio doesn't have any Q-links at all. It does have a touch strip, which you can use to control one Q-link at a time. You choose the Q-link in Q-link mode and then edit its value using the touch strip. Okay, let's move on from hands-on controls and talk about the next major thing that differentiates the MPC X and X Special Edition from the other MPCs, and that's connectivity. If you've got a lot of gear to interface in your studio or in a live show, this is a connectivity dream come true, and will save you the effort of getting USB hubs, additional USB interfaces, or additional MIDI interfaces. First, as someone who likes to experiment with a lot of gear, the connectivity up front is a true treat. If you want to quickly sample something, you've got instrument inputs up front, along with both 3.5mm and 1/4" headphone outputs, both with level knobs and mix controls for the main and secondary outputs. And then this is the only MPC with 2 foot switch inputs. If I go into the menu and preferences and hop into the hardware tab, this is where you control the foot switches, and there are quite a few options here for the 2 foot switches. While we're here, we might as well talk about the VU meters. So it's got them, and you can choose whether they show you values for the current program or the main outputs. There's also an SD card slot up front, like the MPC One, which also has a 3.5mm headphone output up front. The MPC Live 2's SD card is on the back. The MPC Key 61 doesn't have an SD card slot, by the way. Continuing with connectivity, on the back are quite a few MPC X and X Special Edition exclusives. 2 XLR combo inputs with phantom power and gain control on the panel. MPC Key 61 also has 2 of those, as does Force, but these 2 don't. You've got 2 more inputs on X, 4 in total, as opposed to only 2 on MPC Live 2 and MPC 1, with phono support on X and Live. Then you've got 8 1/4" outputs as opposed to 6 on Live and 2 on MPC 1, substantially more MIDI outputs to control external MIDI gear, and 8 individual CV gate outputs for Eurorack and modular gear, as opposed to 4 physical CV gate jacks on Live and 1, though these 4 jacks can actually send out 8 separate signals if you buy 4 splitters. X has 2 Type A USB jacks, like Live and Key, but unlike 1. You can use these Type A jacks to connect to storage devices, MIDI controllers, and audio interfaces, and all of these have a single USB Type B port. 2 more points of connectivity which we can't see all of these except MPC-1 have built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. MPC-1 does have an Ethernet port though. Then one last thing you can't see is cables connected to MPC Live 2. That's because it has a built-in battery in addition to the speakers, which makes it unique across the line. If you're always in the studio and your MPC is always connected to power and speakers, that might not be important to you, but for me, I've got slightly too much gear for everything to always be connected. Live 2 is a great choice for grab-and-go music making. The next striking difference between MPC X and Special Edition and all the others is the sheer number of buttons. Now, it's certainly nice to have some of these. Like I mentioned, these come in really handy. But some of these I think aren't a must. For example, I hardly use the numeric pad, and I don't find much use for these. They don't always work, as you can see here. And say, for example, in some screens, they don't reach all the parameters. I find it just easier to, to touch things and select what I want. The one place where they do come in handy is for selecting parameters from lists quickly. So unfortunately, this encoder isn't a push encoder like it is on all the other MPCs. So say if I wanted to enter this without touching the screen, then I need to use this, and then I could select an item from the list using the encoder or these arrows. But if I wanted to choose an item, then again, I'd need to, since I can't press this, either press this enter button or this enter button. So I do end up using these a lot, but just because this isn't a push encoder. Another option that isn't available elsewhere is to use these 6 buttons when you press F key to select one of the 6 tabs or options on the bottom of the screen. But I found it confusing that these have 2 modes. I just prefer to keep these as shortcuts to what it says over here. And if there's a page with tabs, just press the tabs on the screen. MPC X does have additional transport controls, which are only available on Studio Mark II and the MPC Key 61. So these, I think, come in very handy if you're zooming around the timeline. That said, I personally wouldn't make my decision between all of these just because of the button number count. To me, the buttons on MPC-1 and MPC Key are just fine. One last thing you might consider regarding the buttons on the X and 1 aren't backlit, but they are on all the others. Moving on, let's talk screens. Now, the 10-inch touchscreen on MPC X is huge, relatively speaking, of course, and yes, it's more fun to have one like this than not. However, in my reviews of MPC-1, Key 61, and Live 2, I never complained about the screen size, and I haven't changed my mind. These 7-inch screens are totally usable and generous compared to other offerings on the market. What is a treat here is that the screen flips up with this little kickstand in the back, so it's easy to get it to stick at different angles. It does maybe bounce a bit at several angles, but it's really nice you can tilt it. Like all MPCs, you do use the touch screen a lot, and it is less convenient to hold your hands up, whether the screen is flat or not, sort of up and away from you, as opposed to when it's closer here. And certainly the best from that perspective is MPC Live, where the screen is closest to you. Also, in terms of portability, there's no way to lock the screen in position. So if you turn this upside down, the screen might tilt up a bit. It also sticks out a bit, so you might need a special case with padding for this. Yeah, there's no way to fix it in place, but it does come with this protective cover that you can slip on the screen, which is nice to have even if MPC X just sits around in your studio in case something drops on it as you're rearranging synths or cables around the studio. Let's talk briefly about the pads. All the pads across the MPCs are both velocity and pressure sensitive. Which works quite nicely on all of them. The pads here are as big as on Live and on Studio Mark II. The pads on MPC-1 and MPC Key 61 are smaller. I'm not much of a finger drummer, but personally, I don't mind the small pads at all. One of the things these 3 MPCs don't have, and Key 61 and Studio Mark II do have, is this interesting new touch strip. This strip lets you control a number of parameters depending on the mode that it's in. Now, there's sort of this option here with the XY effects, but that only controls the parameters that are accessible here. This strip on Studio Mark II and MPC Key lets you do things like control pitch bends and the mod wheel. Certainly nice to have. The next thing you won't find on any MPC except MPC Key 61, of course, is black and white keys. Personally, for my workflow, I actually use keys more often than pads to enter notes, so I think keys are super important, but I wouldn't hold not having keys against any of these because you can plug in any MIDI keyboard into any of these, either using the USB port or over 5-pin MIDI. And I actually like the flexibility and option, say, to use a smaller keyboard just to punch in ideas, as opposed to committing to a 5-octave keybed like on MPC Key 61. Let's briefly talk about storage, and I don't mean RAM, but rather the internal hard disk on which you can save multiple projects and samples and expansion packs. Like I mentioned, MPC X Special Edition comes with 32 gigs of internal storage as opposed to 16 on Live and MPC Key and only 4 on MPC One. You can expand all of these with USB drives, these 3 with SD cards, and these 3 with internal SSD cards that you can plug in the bottom. Okay, let's summarize the top 3 pros and cons for MPC X and the Special Edition. On the top of my pros list are the 16 Q-links. They unlock programming and performance functionality that, at least for me, was too obscure and required too many clicks and waiting too much for Windows to open up on the regular MPCs. And again, it's not that I didn't use them and it's not that they're totally useless, but this to me is a completely different story. The second major pro for MPC X is its connectivity. It can be a true studio hub and centerpiece if you want to interface with other gear. Yes, you can add a class-compliant interface to these, but it might add some latency and might not work well, might have clicks. And if you want more than 8 outputs or 4 inputs, you might need to do that here too. But I think for most medium-sized uses, this is good enough. And the inputs up front here are a treat. And then the third pro is an aggregate of all the little or big things, meaning that I don't think there's one big differentiator between MPC X and the others other than the 2 that I mentioned earlier. But when you add up the bigger screen and the fact that it tilts and the extra bundled content and synths and the extra controls and the fun factor and faster workflow of having all these buttons, all of these together is certainly a pro compared to the others. Then on the cons side, probably the biggest is the price. While you are getting 4 gigs of RAM and extra plugin content, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, since you can make fundamentally the same music on any of these, this is way more expensive than anything else on the line. And if you think the Q-links are important, which I think they are, you can get sort of halfway there pairing these with an extra MIDI controller. Now, another option you should consider is the MPC X, not the Special Edition. I don't know if they're still going to be selling them or not, but if your projects don't have a lot of samples, then you might be able to get all the benefits of the buttons and the Q-links for a lower price with the original MPC X. Then the next con for MPC X is its size. You need to allocate quite a bit of desktop real estate in your studio for it. It's nowhere near as portable as others in the series. And in terms of portability, if you just want an MPC to grab and go, nothing beats the MPC Live 2 with its internal battery and speakers. Then the third con for this is truly a first world problem, but I promised 3 cons in the title of the video. I think it would have been better if the data encoder was a push encoder. And yes, I know that there are 2 enter buttons nearby, but it would be easier just to press this like the other encoders in the series. So that's it for this video. If you like these insights, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.